Well, when we last gathered this way, we were looking at some foundational stories from the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. We were in Genesis. We were looking at how God set a promise in motion to give land to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whose name would become Israel. And Israel's sons, 12 sons, would become the 12 tribes of Israel. So we pick up today with chapters 37 to 50 of Genesis, for starters, kind of skipping through the Testament quickly. And we're looking first at Jacob's family, the story that picks up. So this is Israel, but we call him Jacob most of the time, and his 12 sons. Now, they lived in the land of Canaan, even though they had not conquered the land. They were nomadic people, a kind of a migrant band. And as the story unfolds, we hear that Joseph is Jacob's favorite son. And he is 17 years old as the story begins. And Jacob shows him incredible favoritism. He even gives him a really fancy, colorful coat and shows him various privileges. Joseph, at 17, is pretty arrogant, and he loves to tattle on his brothers, and he talks big. He knows how to interpret dreams, and he has cool dreams, and he sort of tries these out on his brothers, who resent it because the dreams are all about how he's going to lord over them in a future time. His brothers really don't like him. In fact, they want to kill him, and they plot to kill him, and then they think better of that, and they sell him into slavery. Now, Scripture tells us that Joseph was good-looking, but he also must have been charming and smart, because even in difficult circumstances that begin for him at age 17, he always seems to come out on top. So he's taken to Egypt, and he's sold to Potiphar, who is the captain of Pharaoh's guard. And there, he is immediately put in charge of the household. So he must have been doing something right. Potiphar's wife takes a shine to him, and when he rejects her advances, she turns on him and accuses him of making a pass at her, and he gets thrown in jail, where he is immediately made a kind of trustee over some of the other prisoners. And it's in that space that he's able to show his gifts as an interpreter of dreams, and eventually that gets the attention of Pharaoh, who's having dreams that he cannot understand. When Joseph speaks to him and interprets those dreams for him, immediately he is put in charge of the whole country, so that he has 7 years of abundance in which to prepare for 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh trusts Joseph with this huge responsibility to address a famine that is coming. It is that famine that eventually brings Joseph's father and his brothers down to Egypt. There's about 70 families by this time, and it's 20 years after they sold him as a slave. Now, it's a complicated reunion, but it basically has a happily ever after kind of ending. And that is how the Israelites get to Egypt. Now, the story picks up in the book of Exodus, and it is 400 years later. The Pharaoh who is in power now knows nothing about Joseph. Time has passed. He is a piece of history that is long forgotten. All Pharaoh knows in this generation is that there's way too many Israelites in his country. And he's suspicious of them, and he's afraid of them. And so he begins to make life very hard for them, enslaving them, and actually killing the sons in the family, so they will not be able to continue reproducing in future generations. You may recall, if you know these stories, that Moses appears on the scene. He is spared as an infant because his very smart mother and sister put him in the hands of the Pharaoh's daughter, who raises him as her own. Now, when he becomes a young man and time has passed, he kills an Egyptian guard who is mistreating one of these Israelite slaves. And then he has to run away in fear for his own life. And he finds his way to Jethro, who is a Midianite priest out in the wilderness. Jethro might actually be a distant cousin of Moses, according to some research. He spends 40 years with Jethro and his family, herding sheep, taking a wife, having sons. And eventually it is out in this wilderness, after 40 years there, that Moses encounters God in that famous burning bush. And it would be near this same location that Moses would receive the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. Moses is a reluctant hero at best. He's a stutterer, so he doesn't really want to speak on behalf of God. He is fearful to return to Egypt because he doesn't know if the Pharaoh or the people of Israel will welcome him. He has had kind of a foot in both worlds, but after 40 years, he really doesn't have a relationship with either group. But he does go forth, and with God and with help from Aaron, his brother, he does in fact face up to Pharaoh, and he wins the release of what Scripture says is 600,000 people. God is at work in this. God sends plagues upon Egypt, 7 of them in all, terrible plagues, the worst one being the last one, in which God now kills firstborn sons of the Egyptians, of anyone who does not have the blood sacrifice of a lamb over the door, something the Israelites have all been told to do. So their homes will be passed over then by death. And thus the celebration of Passover is now the event, even today, that recalls them being protected on that night and celebrates their release from Egypt. Well, when God speaks to Moses from the burning bush, he, and I'm using the language as it is in Scripture, he speaks of how he has heard the cries of his people. My people, he says, my people. More than once, he calls them my people. It seems as if the promises of hundreds of years before are being put in motion again. If we take this story just at face value, God seems to have been content to have his people in Egypt for all those years while life was good. And the promised land that was awaiting them seems to have gone on hold during that time. But now God hears the cries of my people, and God reactivates this promise to give them a land flowing with milk and honey. Once they have escaped Pharaoh and crossed the sea where Pharaoh's army is lost, it's so dramatic, one would think things would go smoothly. And instead, it takes 40 years more for the people to be ready for a new life. Even though they know the ancient stories of God's promises, they have been what I would call Egyptianized over the centuries. They no longer think of themselves as a particular people. They need some laws, so they start with 10, and then they get tons of laws. But they need to organize themselves as a nation, as a people. And in the midst of all this, with God doing the best God can do, they whine and they complain and they fail and they falter. It takes a couple of generations actually dying off in order for them to move forward and leave Egypt completely behind. No one who marched out of Egypt, not even Moses, makes it into the promised land beyond that wilderness, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, who proved their faithfulness in ways that others had not. And it's these 2 men who lead the people of Israel into Canaan, where they conquer the major cities, the most famous of which is Jericho, that Jeff was singing about, and they take the land then as their own. And that is how the 12 tribes of Israel got out of Egypt and into the promised land.